Her breasts were completely exposed. That was the point. The figurine is only 30 centimeters tall, made of painted clay, and she is holding live snakes. She is also 3,500 years old, and she is the reason historians had to tear up everything they thought they knew about what women wore underneath. Before the bra, there was no single solution. There was a 4,000-year war, over fabric, over bodies, over who got to decide what a woman should look like. One side built something extraordinary in the 15th century and then buried it so completely that nobody found it for 500 years. The other side gave us a 13-inch waist. This is not a story about underwear. It is a story about power and containment, about a technology that was invented and then deliberately abandoned, about the long, strange, occasionally brutal journey from a Bronze Age goddess holding snakes on a Greek island to the morning a chemist in a New York bedroom grabbed 2 silk handkerchiefs and changed everything. The object at the center of this story is so ordinary today that most people never think about it. That is exactly why its history is worth knowing. In the ruins of the Palace of Knossos on the island of Crete, a British archaeologist named Arthur Evans was moving through the rubble when he pulled something small from the soil. A clay figurine, about 30 centimeters tall, painted in bright colors, arms raised, holding a serpent in each hand. Her skirt was layered and elaborate. Her bodice was fitted, rigid almost, and completely open at the front. Her breasts fully exposed, forward-facing, deliberate. Evans labeled her the Snake Goddess. She was 3,500 years old. Most people who hear about her assume the exposed chest is either religious symbolism or some quirk of a single unusual artifact, a one-off curiosity from an ancient dig. It is neither. That figurine is evidence of an entire civilization's approach to the female body, an approach so different from everything that followed that it reads today like a message from a parallel history. And she is the first piece of a puzzle, whose second piece, a sealed vault in an Austrian castle, hidden for 5 centuries, would not turn up until the summer of 2008. The island of Crete in the Aegean Sea, around 1600 BCE. The Minoan civilization is at its peak, a maritime culture of palace builders, traders, and artisans, whose reach stretched across the eastern Mediterranean. They left no decoded written language, so everything we know about how they lived comes from what they made: frescoes, figurines, painted walls. And what those images show, consistently and without apology, is women in structured fitted garments that lift and frame the breasts while leaving them completely uncovered. This was not undergarment. This was the clothing, the outer layer, what you wore when you walked through the palace, attended a ceremony, participated in public life. Wall paintings across multiple Minoan palace sites show groups of women dressed this way. Not one rogue fresco, not one outlier figurine, but a repeated visual pattern across sites and decades. Whether the exposed chest was a fashion norm, a ritual distinction, or a marker of rank is debated by scholars. What is not debated is that the imagery is real and consistent. There is evidence the fitted Minoan bodice was shaped and stiffened to hold the breast in position, not wired in the modern sense, but constructed to require skill and care. A woman wearing one was not merely dressed, she was making something visible. The civilization that produced this imagery collapsed around 1200 BCE, probably through a combination of earthquake, drought, and the wider Bronze Age disruption that shook the eastern Mediterranean. But the image of that snake goddess, poised, exposed, unbothered, survived in clay, and the world that replaced the Minoans had almost exactly the opposite philosophy. When the great Greek city-states rose to dominance, roughly 1,000 years after the Minoan peak, they brought with them a philosophy of the body that was almost precisely the inverse. Greek women wrapped bands of linen or wool across the chest, tied or pinned at the back. These garments had several names, depending on the era and the region: the apodesmos, the strophion, the mastodesmos, the mastodeton. The names all translate to essentially the same thing: breastband, and they all accomplish the same physical task: flatten, compress, contain. Homer's Iliad references the goddess Aphrodite removing a kestos, a finely worked breast girdle, from her chest. That passage dates to approximately 750 BCE, which means the breastband was already so embedded in Greek daily life that it had made its way into mythology. It was cultural furniture, not an invention. In the comedy Lysistrata, written by Aristophanes around 411 BCE, a woman slowly removes her strophion as part of a deliberate act of seduction. The garment was erotic enough to function as a dramatic prop, which means it was visible, known, and familiar to the audience watching the play. Where Minoan garments lifted and framed the breast, Greek bands suppressed and contained. A flat, bound chest was a respectable chest. Young women in Sparta wore breastbands during athletic training. Even in a culture that celebrated the female body for strength and movement, the default was still constraint. The management of the breast was already a moral statement, not merely a practical one. A woman in classical Greece who chose to go unbound in public was not just making a fashion choice. She was making a statement about her character, or having one made about her. That philosophy, that the female body is something that requires management, that an unmanaged body is a moral problem, is not merely a Greek quirk. It is the load-bearing beam of the next 2,000 years of Western fashion. Rome absorbed Greece, and then, as Rome typically did, added layers of practicality. Roman women had not one breast garment, but several, selected depending on the situation. The strophium was a bandeau-style band of linen or soft leather wrapped around the chest and tied at the back, the everyday option. The mamillare was a softer, more compressive version for women who preferred a minimal silhouette. And then there was the athletic option. The single most striking piece of evidence for how Roman women managed breast support during physical activity comes from a Roman villa in Sicily, the Villa Romana del Casale, whose floors contain one of the most detailed mosaics in the ancient world. An entire room is covered in figures of women competing in athletic events, throwing the discus, lifting weights, playing ball games, receiving victory crowns. Every single one of them is wearing what looks, with startling precision, like a modern bikini, a band across the chest and a brief garment below. Historians call them the bikini girls, and the image is so accurate to a modern athletic bra that when the mosaic was first properly excavated in the early 20th century, some scholars questioned whether it could be genuinely ancient. It is. The mosaic dates to the early 4th century CE. The breast garments in the image appear shaped and stitched rather than simply wound, though how far that construction represents structured, cut and sewn athletic support versus a draped and pinned band remains a matter of interpretation among art historians. What matters is that the Romans had already understood something that would later seem radical, that movement requires a different approach than modesty. The problem is that almost nothing physical survived from this period. We can see these garments in art, read scattered descriptions in texts, but the actual objects rotted and were discarded. We know they existed from the images left behind, but we cannot hold one. And that absence from the archaeological record is part of what created the gap that makes what was found in that Austrian castle in 2008 so remarkable. On the other side of the world, independently, and with no documented contact with the Mediterranean tradition, women in India and China had arrived at the same basic conclusion. The breast, in a life that involves gravity and movement, benefits from some form of management. In India, Sanskrit texts from roughly the same centuries as classical Rome describe the stanapata, a breastband worn by women of various social classes, adapted in style and material depending on region, climate, and rank. A Sanskrit play from around the 4th century references a heroine's breastcloth as a dramatic narrative object. She removes it, it becomes a plot device, in a scene that mirrors almost exactly the Lysistrata episode from Greek theatre written 7 centuries earlier. 2 playwrights, 2 languages, 2 continents. The same object used the same way in a story. In China, during the Ming Dynasty, roughly between the late 14th and mid-17th century, women wore a garment called the dudo, a diamond-shaped cloth tied across the chest and stomach. The dudo was not about support in any structural sense. It was about achieving a smooth, flat, uninterrupted silhouette, the opposite of the Minoan approach, though sharing the Greek goal of suppressing visible contour. Each culture arrived at a different answer: lift and expose, flatten and bind, support and shape. compress for aesthetics. But every single one of them arrived at the same problem independently. That convergence is worth sitting with for a moment, because what comes next in the Western European story is not a solution. It is a detour of 400 years. The summer of 2008. Lengberg Castle sits in the mountains of East Tyrol in Austria, its stone walls dating back to the 12th century. A renovation project breaks through a section of flooring that had not been disturbed since the 15th century. Beneath the boards, sealed in the dry conditions of a hidden subfloor cavity, workers find a cache of materials that had been sitting in total darkness for more than 500 years. Over 2,700 textile fragments, scraps of leather and silk and wool, more than 200 coins, playing cards hand-painted and remarkably preserved, bone fragments, pottery shards. Archaeologists from the University of Innsbruck begin cataloguing the textiles, and then, in among the scraps and fragments, they find 4 pieces of linen that make the team stop. Because these pieces are not wrappings or bands or shapeless cloth, they have cups, distinct, separately cut, sewn cups, shaped to fit a breast, not to flatten or bind one. They have straps. They have what appear to be eyelets for lacing. One of them extends down to a band at the ribcage. They look, and there is no more precise way to say this, like bras. The problem is not that the objects look wrong. It is that nothing in the historical record should have put them there. The assumption among textile historians had been that the medieval period simply did not have this technology. Breast bands and bindings, yes. Structured sewn garments with individual cups, no. There were scattered references in European literature that had always been difficult to interpret. A chronicle written in the late 15th century by a man named Conrad Stolle in Thuringia mentions women's shirts that had bags in which they placed their breasts. Stolle describes the garments as, in direct translation, all indecent, and moves on. Other medieval sources mention breast bags and garments with structural elements at the chest, but the references were vague enough that historians read them as exaggerations or descriptions of simple bindings. The Lengberg finds are not vague. Fiber samples are sent to the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich for carbon-14 dating. The results come back definitive. The linen dates to the 15th century. One of the 4 garments has 2 cups, each made from a separate piece of linen, sewn together vertically, a wide band extending to the ribcage, eyelets for lacing in the back, and decorative needle lace around the cups. It is not a primitive approximation of the modern bra. It is the modern bra, made 500 years earlier by somebody whose name we will never know, in a castle in the Austrian mountains, and then sealed into a floor and forgotten. Which raises the only question that matters. If the technology existed in the 15th century, why did the next 400 years look nothing like this? The answer arrives in the form of a woman from Florence who married a French king and brought with her something far more rigid than linen. Catherine de' Medici arrived in France from Florence in 1533, at the age of 14, as the bride of the man who would become King Henry II. She brought with her Italian Renaissance tastes and a fashion preference that would reshape European women's clothing for the next 3.5 centuries. Catherine's preference was for the corset, not the relatively simple stiffened bodice of the 15th century, but a more extreme, more unforgiving version. Later accounts attached to her name the claim that she required court ladies to maintain a waist of 13 inches, a figure modern dress historians treat as legend rather than documented fact, but one that captures something real about the direction of fashion. To achieve extreme compression, women wore what was called at the time the core, the body, a tightly laced garment stiffened internally with layers of fabric and paste, and reinforced at the front with a busk, a long, flat piece of whalebone or wood, carved into a blade-like shape and slid into a channel, sewn into the front of the garment. It ran from the sternum to below the waist and made the front of the torso completely rigid. Later versions would use steel. The effect was total. The floating ribs, the lower ribs not attached to the sternum, were forced inward by constant pressure. Internal organs shifted. Contemporary accounts from the French court describe ladies-in-waiting being laced into their stays by attendants who put one knee in the small of the woman's back to gain enough leverage to pull the laces tight. At the French court, this was high fashion. The silhouette it produced, the impossibly narrow waist, the rigid shelf-like bust, the elongated torso, became the visual definition of aristocratic femininity. And because France was the center of European fashion influence in this era, what Catherine's court wore, the rest of the European elite began to wear. What the corset encoded, that a woman's body in its natural state was unacceptable, that discipline and constraint were prerequisites for social participation. What makes this moment historically significant and historically frustrating is the timing. The Lengberg garments were made in the late 1400s, possibly the early 1500s. The structured bra existed. It was in use somewhere, and it was about to be buried under 4 centuries of whalebone. By the turn of the 17th century, the corset had stopped being a French court preference and had become something approaching a European law. Not a written law, but a social one, enforced by peer pressure, moral judgment, and the complete absence of an acceptable alternative. The garments themselves grew more extreme as the decades passed. Early 17th century corsets were made from layers of stiffened linen reinforced with whalebone, the flexible strips of keratin from the jaw of the baleen whale, sewn into vertical channels throughout the body. By mid-century, some versions incorporated wooden rods. By the 18th century, some used heavy leather nearly 1/4 of an inch thick, and others used steel rods that ran the full length of the torso. The moral architecture surrounding the corset grew alongside its physical architecture. A Swiss visitor to England in the mid-18th century recorded that in rural villages, all women went laced, regardless of class or occupation, because, in his wording, loose stays indicated loose morals. Read that sentence again. The physical looseness of a garment was read as evidence of the moral looseness of the person inside it. A farm laborer working the fields in summer heat was expected to wear a boned, laced corset, because the alternative was a statement about who she was as a person. The shape that the corset imposed shifted with the fashion. Sometimes a conical torso, sometimes an exaggerated hourglass. But the constant, through all of these variations, was rigidity. The natural shape of the female body was the problem. The corset was the solution. And so the garment imported by Catherine's court became, over the following century and a half, the unquestioned foundation of women's dress across most of Europe and, by extension, the European colonial world. It crossed the Atlantic. It went to India with British officials' wives. It was sold at trading posts on the edges of settlement frontiers. It was not an option that women chose from a range of garments. It was the only respectable choice, and the technology that might have offered a different path had been sealed in the floor of a castle in Austria and forgotten. The Victorian era took the logic of the corset and followed it to its conclusion. Starting in the 1830s, the hourglass silhouette became the visual ideal, and corsets were engineered specifically to produce it. They were boned with steel and whalebone. The lacing pulled the waist to whatever measurement the woman, or whoever was lacing her, considered appropriate. Tight lacing became a subculture with its own literature. Women exchanged tips in popular magazines about how to reduce their waist measurements incrementally, sleeping in their corsets, beginning the process in childhood, training the ribs gradually so the floating bones moved without breaking. Children were put into corsets, starting as young as 3 or 4. Pregnant women wore modified corsets because appearing visibly pregnant in public was considered indelicate. Physicians wrote papers on what they called corset liver, the grooves found in the liver tissue of women who had worn extremely tight stays for many years. Cases of fractured ribs and displaced organs appeared in medical literature. Medical warnings circulated widely, but the social cost of not wearing a corset was, for many women, higher than the physical cost of wearing one. By the 1870s, a serious opposition had assembled. Dress reformers, physicians, suffragists, novelists argued publicly that the corset was not just uncomfortable but dangerous, not just a fashion choice, but a political instrument. They designed alternatives, published pamphlets, organized campaigns. But the corset did not die from argument. It died, ultimately, from war. When the First World War made steel a military resource more valuable than fashion, the industry that had dominated women's dress for 4 centuries lost its material base almost overnight. What replaced it had been waiting in various forms for nearly half a century, and its story begins in Paris in 1889 with a corsetière named Herminie Cadolle, who cut the corset in two, patented the upper half as a separate bust supporter, and called it the corselet gorge. 25 years later, a New York socialite named Mary Phelps Jacob sewed 2 silk handkerchiefs together with a ribbon, received a patent, sold it to Warner Brothers Corset Company for $1,500, and the word bra entered the language. The technology in those 2 silk handkerchiefs was not new. A version of it had been sitting in the subfloor of a castle in East Tyrol since the 1400s. It had taken 4 centuries of whalebone, a world war, and 2 women with scissors to bring it back. From a figurine in the ruins of a Bronze Age palace to a sealed vault in an Austrian castle. From a Florentine queen's court to a wartime materials shortage that ended a 4th-century fashion. The history of what women wore before the bra is really a history of who got to define the female body and what it would cost a woman to disagree. The Minoan snake goddess lifted and framed, the Greeks bound and contained. Rome was pragmatic. A medieval craftsperson in the Austrian mountains built a bra in linen with sewn cups and decorative lace, and the world sealed it in a floor and forgot about it for 500 years. What followed was not the absence of technology. It was the presence of a different priority entirely. And when the corset finally collapsed, not from argument or reform, but from a global war that needed its steel, what replaced it turned out to be the same idea that had been waiting in the archaeological record all along. The history of ordinary objects hides some of the most extraordinary stories of how humans actually lived. If that kind of history is what you are here for, subscribe and you will get more of it every week.